welcome to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker, your host. Today is September 11th, 2018. So glad to be with you today. I'm very excited for my guest, who is Joelle Casteix, and I'll tell you a little bit about her in a minute here. I just want to give a few announcements. Some of you have heard that I have reached my initial fundraising goal for Mormon Mental Health Podcast, which means that it will be able to survive past 2018. So I'm thrilled about that. I really love offering this service, and I'm hopeful that you'll continue to be willing to be donators. Just because we reached our minimal goal doesn't mean that we still couldn't use a lot more funds to do a lot more things with it, increase the quality, able to have more resources at our hands, and just be able to run this whole endeavor a little smoother and better than I can on my own. So please consider continuing donations if you haven't already. And if you find this podcast valuable, it would be very helpful and meaningful to me if we can raise more than just the minimum amount. So given that, I also want to just give a reminder for anybody who's interested in the Mormon Matters Retreat. We have one coming up in October, the 12th through the 14th. These are weekend retreats. People who find these very useful are those trying to have a nuanced journey somewhere within the Mormon realm. So whether they're going through a faith transition, whether they're feeling like they're maybe a more progressive voice in their ward, whether they have family members that are also transitioning or in a different space than they are and want kind of tips on how to communicate and how to have better relationships with people within the Mormon community that maybe we just differ on opinions, etc. So these are very highly rated, and you can find all the information on that on mormonmatters.org. And I will be presenting with Dan Witherspoon, Jana Reese, and Jennifer White. So very excited for that. I will also be giving a short presentation on the principles of sexual health here in Wichita, Kansas on September 23rd. That's coming up here in just a few weeks at Wichita Oasis. So you can look up Wichita Oasis on the internet as well and find more information about that. All right, without further ado, let's get going. So I met Joelle during my advocacy work with Sam Young for the protectldschildren.org way back kind of when he first started having, well, I guess during the first press conference that he held in Salt Lake City. He invited me to come out and speak to those issues as a mental health professional, and Joelle Casteix was also invited to be part of that press conference as she's a representative of SNAP, which stands for Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. So Joelle comes from a Catholic background, and excited for her to share with us more about this network, her story, and maybe have some insights for us that, as we're going through some of our own issues in Mormonism that, has been dealt with in other church systems, specifically the Catholic Church as well. So welcome to the program, Joelle. So glad to have you with us.
Thank you. As a brief correction there, at the time I was with SNAP, I am no longer with them. I've started my own organization now.
Okay.
It's called, because we all have to go with an acronym, it's called STOP, Survivors Taking on Predators, because SNAP focuses mostly on support groups. And my focus is mostly on the kind of advocacy that I did for Sam, which is speaking out, using the media, activating people towards positive change, because I believe that the support group model is not terribly effective unless it's moderated by a mental health professional, and peer-led support groups can be somewhat problematic at times. So I started my own organization because I believe that the true path to healing really requires, for survivors, you have to channel your anger into positive change. So my new organization is STOP. So you can find it at stop.team. That's what I'm doing now. But it is complementary to what SNAP is doing.
Okay, great. Stop.team. I'll make sure we link to that. So how comfortable are you just sharing a little bit of your own personal background and story as a backdrop to the rest of the interview?
Very comfortable.
Okay.
I was born and raised in Southern California, and like many survivors of sexual abuse, I came from a vulnerable background. My mother was an alcoholic. My dad was in denial. And By the time I was a sophomore in high school, I was suicidal and had spent time in a psychiatric hospital here in Orange County, California. But I was also a straight A student and in the elite touring choir. And so I was a young junior. I was only 15. And when I started my junior year, we had a new choir director. And that choir director was told to take very special care of me because I was an excellent student. I was a great singer. I was being coached to go to conservatories for college because I was that good. And he said, by all means, I will definitely take care of her. And he instead groomed me as a predator and began sexually abusing me. And over the next 2 years, he sexually abused me. And by the time I graduated, I was pregnant and had a sexually transmitted disease. And the worst part about it was that school administrators knew. I went to
at your Catholic school.
At my Catholic high school. I went to a vice principal when the abuse began. And I said, because, it's very confusing because when you're being groomed, that's how predators trick you into thinking that sexual abuse is okay. They blur body boundaries. They use sexual talk. They flatter you. They give you gifts. They normalize sexual behavior. And so I went to this vice principal who I trusted because when I had been hospitalized, she was the one who was very, very kind to me. And I said, something weird is going on and I don't understand and I'm confused. And she said, oh, no, Joelle, that's okay. It's fine because that's what love is. And I'm like, what? Because the man who sexually abused me had already gone to her and let her know that this was happening. And so that if I reported that she wouldn't do anything. And so I had nowhere to go after that. And so
do you want to talk a little bit about, because I think most people kind of understand that probably, there's probably going to be sexual predators in probably every type of community and church organization, school organization, there's just a part of life in that regard, unfortunately. At the same time, I think what can be a little bit more shocking is when there seem to be either systemic cover-ups or like the system itself is somewhat wrapped up in protecting sexual predators or minimizing sexual concerns. Do you have any thoughts about why that is such a common thing that seems to happen in communities?
Yeah. Sexual predators are attracted to institutions, especially religious institutions, because they are given positions of power. In religious institutions, there is always that power of forgiveness. In the Catholic Church, you go to confession and you're forgiven. They have instant access to children. In a male-dominated church structure where only men can ascend to positions of power, predators are instantly attracted to those. So in the Catholic Church, the Mormon Church, they have instant power positions and they are not questioned. And so it's very easy for that systemic cover-up to flourish. And it's in institutions, it's stunning how this cover-up continues, because it's much easier in the long view for an institution, whether it be U.S. Gymnastics or the LDS Church or the Catholic Church, to cover up for an abuser than it is to protect one child. So let's look at my own case. I was going to be gone in 2 years when the vice principal found out that I was being abused. She's like, Joelle's going to be gone in 2 years. We can shut her up for 2 years. And that was an easy job to do because victims they don't report. They are vulnerable. They are weak. They don't really talk to people very much. And when someone in a position of power is using that power and using sex as a weapon, they can maintain that power very, very easily. And in the long view, it's much easier to keep that predator in power and shut down the victims. And so when survivors then get, they heal, they go through the process, and the process can take decades. And we're talking, they go through alcoholism, drug abuse, self-mutilation, self-hatred, self-loathing, hypersexuality, depression, all those things. And they get to a point of healing. And when they finally realize, oh my God, what happened to me was a crime, they realize that this predator has still been in this position of power for sometimes 20, 30 years. But by then, their statute of limitations has expired and there's nothing that they can do. And for someone like me, when I talk to groups of people, I'm the first to say, yes, child sexual abuse happens everywhere. And the Catholic Church is very quick to say, oh, yes, it happens everywhere. And that's what they do to try to normalize the behavior. But the real crime is the cover-up, because I look at a child sex predator as a lion in a lion cage. And you look at someone who's supposed to, it's a metaphor that we use a lot. So if a lion trainer is training lions and he leaves the cage open and the lion jumps out of the cage and eats a kid, is that the lion's fault? No, it's the lion trainer's fault. And we take the child sex abuse and cover-up scandal and look at it the same way. If a bishop in the Catholic Church knows that a priest can sexually abuse kids and doesn't do something about it, and allows that priest to stay in a parish where he sexually abuses kids, whose fault is it? Is it the fault, who is more to blame? And I am more inclined to blame the bishops who leave that cage open and allow that priest to sexually molest the kids. The priests these child predators should be put in jail. These child predators should be locked away, kept as far away from kids as humanly possible. But instead, the systemic cover-up allows these predators to continually have access to kids. And this is what's happening in the Mormon church, or the LDS church, and it's what's happening in the Catholic church, and what happened in U.S. gymnastics, and on and on and on and on.
Yeah, and so in trying to help understand at least your perspective on what that's about, is it, because I'm guessing most people don't wake up in the morning going, oh, I can't wait to leave the lion cage open and have kids be eaten, right? And so is it that when that happens, is it your opinion that it's the systems or the people who are part of the cover-up, what are they motivated by? Is it just not wanting the church to look bad, or themselves to look bad, not wanting to take responsibility? What types of motivators?
There are many reasons. In the Catholic Church, and this was a stunning revelation to me. We always talked about, the bella figura, keeping the good face, protecting the church from scandal. But there is a really bright reporter out of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and she presented to a class I was teaching at UCI Law School. And she did interview after interview after interview in the St. Paul Archdiocese. And she said, she came across a different phenomenon. And she goes, it's a lot like the band of brothers going through war. She said, when you go through seminary with a lot of these priests in the Catholic Church, they go through seminary together starting in the 7th or 8th grade. They have a band of brothers mentality. They consider themselves special and different, and they will protect each other. They think, well, we are priests, we are different. He may be no good child molester, but he's my no good child molester. He's been my friend for 30 years. Gosh, Father Joe, just don't do it anymore. We'll move you over here. Come on. You'll be fine. I'll take care of you. You're my guy. In the LDS church, I'm seeing the same phenomenon. It's, you were chosen as a bishop because I was called by God and chose you. You're my guy. I know you would never do this. We're a band of brothers. And the continuation of the cover-up, as it moves up into higher levels, in many ways becomes a quid pro quo. So as it moves up into higher levels, as men are promoted in these power structures, one guy will say, well, yeah, maybe I exploited seminarians, or maybe I molested kids, but I know you have a girlfriend, or I know you had an affair. So I'll keep quiet about your sexual aberrations if you keep quiet about my sexual aberrations. And in the Catholic Church, a lot of that has to do with the whole problem that they have with homosexuality in the priesthood, which to them is just, it's this horrible scandal to them. And so what starts out as a horrible crime just then becomes a bargaining chip later on. And it's so profoundly sad that they, what becomes you're my guy, I'll protect you, we'll just move you, is this horrific crime that destroys kids' lives. And then later on just becomes a bargaining chip. And it's such a normalized behavior to them. In the Catholic Church, they see the sexual molestation of a child as the same crime as having a girlfriend. And that's profoundly tragic. And they see the sexual molestation of a female child as nothing. I mean, that's not barely even a sin. And that's even worse.
So I don't expect you to, know a whole lot about Mormon dynamics. I mean, you're speaking very clearly about Catholic dynamics, but it does seem like you're not necessarily, you're definitely going a step further on intentionality than, oh, this is just kind of like a subconscious protection of a community. In other words, people are just going to naturally protect their own. You're saying this really goes into more intentionality than that, in the sense that, I realize that I'm going to use this information to either protect myself or protect somebody I care about, in spite of understanding very clearly that there are lives at risk.
Yes. And you see that when you get to the higher levels of a power structure. And you see that when you get to the Larry Nassar scandal at Michigan State. We see that at USC. They have a scandal right now with a gynecologist who sexually molested a boatload of patients there, and now the president of the university has had to step down. We saw that at Penn State. And I think that as soon as victims within the LDS Church have civil rights, if there's rights in the civil courts, and are able to piece apart the cover-up of what's been going on with the worthiness meetings, that we will find that the higher-ups in the church knew that many of the bishops were taking advantage and molesting teens in these meetings. And there'll be a quid pro quo going all the way up to the top.
So what is, I'm just curious from an outsider's perspective, what is your take on what's happening in my church in regards to what are things that you see that are either similar to what you have come to be very aware of in your own community, and maybe what are some differences?
When I first heard about Sam's story, I was contacted not because of the work that I at the time was doing with SNAP, but because of my child protection work, my other platform, which is I'm a TED speaker and a writer and a child protection advocate and stuff like that. And I thought I was misreading what this woman sent to me. I thought it was a joke. I'm like, no, this cannot be true.
What part? What did she send to you? What were you looking at?
I was looking at a press report about the worthiness interviews. I'm like, there's no way that any organization has, first of all, worthiness, something called a worthiness interview. And secondly, closed door meetings with minors and adults one-on-one. I was floored. Like, this can't be happening. It cannot be happening. And I was shocked. And then I read more of the press reports, and I'm like, oh my God, this is really happening. And this is in light of, this is post 2002 Catholic scandal. This is post Harvey Weinstein. This is post, all the other, Penn State in the middle of the gymnastics scandal and everything else. I mean, you can't even go into your pediatrician's office one-on-one with a kid and a doctor. I mean, I don't even see my own doctor one-on-one if he's a male without another person in the office. I mean, that's how it is. And so I was floored. And when I decided to, I put out a statement, I just realized I had to reach out to Sam to help. And that's why I instantly got involved. And I realized that, I had some familiarity with how the LDS political structure handles survivors of sexual abuse. And I know it's not with compassion, because I know for people who have sued, and I know it's been absolutely disastrous to the point where they will bankrupt attorneys, and attorneys won't take the cases a lot of times. So they spend a lot of money to just run over victims with the bus. And so I was like, well, I guess it wasn't that shocking that these meetings still continue.
And this is information that you've come across just in working with victims.
Survivors. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I knew I had to do what I could. And I remember talking to Sam and saying, Sam, because he did everything right. He didn't call his group, the LDS Church is a bunch of meanies. I mean, he just called it, protect LDS kids. And that's the way to do it. And he got just this wonderful groundswell of support. And it was all about, let's work together. And he got all the survivors to come forward. But I told him, I said, be prepared to be, excommunicated. And he looked at me, he's like, oh, my church would never do that to me. And I said, well, be prepared. So,
why were you thinking that already? Like, what were you seeing ahead that maybe Sam couldn't?
Oh, I just knew how the power structure worked. He was in direct violation. He was challenging them. He was saying that they had a problem that they did not want to admit happened. And then he took 1,000 people and marched right up to the front doors of their office building. And they don't like that. That doesn't reflect well upon the unity of the LDS Church.
And why isn't it, when you think about, what are your thoughts about, there are, for example, examples of Catholic bishops that have come forward, I think, in appropriate ways. When you think about religious principles and religious communities, why would it be so hard for a religious system to just say, yeah, we're on board, we're going to protect children, and we're going to, be willing to look at the bad apples that are infiltrating our system. And we want to have trauma-informed care. And we want to have things that will help people, because so many of these messages are what you hear on every Sunday, right? About protecting kiddos and widows and being kind and loving. Why is there such a disconnect?
Because they're a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies move at glacial paces. If you look at any time there's been a radical change in a religious faith, that radical change was really radical. We have Protestantism, for example, and they don't like to change their ways. They operate on tradition. They operate on pay, pray, and obey. They operate on a power structure. They operate on consensus and agreement. And if and correct me if I'm wrong, is the Council of Elders, is that what it's called?
For the disciplinary council, you mean?
Or no, the highest ranking, the men who make all the decisions for the Mormon Church.
The apostles and the prophet, yes. Mm-hmm.
So if they sat around and said, we're going to change our ways, and we're going to, make sure that this never happens again, and we're going to change the worthiness meetings. Well, what happens if 3 or 4 of those guys are implicated in covering up for abuse? Now we have trouble. So it will shake up the entire power structure.
So in other words, in order to correct, some people may have to actually take responsibility for having done something wrong to begin with.
Exactly. We have a real accountability problem.
And then the fear that that it would, if we autocorrect in that way, that would be what, faith debilitating to people or something, like this idea that people can't handle the truth.
Yes. And it's like, well, what about my nephew? I think my nephew has a problem. Well, what about this guy? Well, what about that guy? And well, it will turn into a witch hunt. Well, what if someone, thinks I did something wrong? What about this? It's very difficult for people to stand up for the truth. And I didn't realize how difficult it was for people until I decided that I was going to stand up and say, sexual abuse is wrong. I'm suing the Catholic Church and I'm using my name. It's astounding what people will do and say. And I had family members say, Joelle, are you sure you want to do this? This is embarrassing. You know, friends will turn their backs on you. How could you do this to the church? So on and so forth. Fear is humankind's biggest motivator. And fear will make people do drastic things. And if you and I can sit here and say, God, why aren't these people doing the right thing? But if you look at the power structure of the LDS Church, or the power structure of the Catholic Church, or the power structure of U.S. gymnastics, they are motivated by fear, not by truth.
Did you feel like when you made that decision to publicly sue your church, was that part of your success? In other words, there are lots of people who do bring lawsuits to churches, but it kind of stays, under a non-disclosure agreement, or it isn't necessarily super public. What are your thoughts about pros and cons of those types of approaches?
Well, non-disclosure agreements always lead to trouble. Any survivor who's put under a non-disclosure agreement, those are now illegal, which is great.
They are illegal? Is that what you just said?
Yeah, they're illegal in California, at least.
Oh, yeah. I don't think they're illegal everywhere.
When it comes to being a doe, that's a very personal decision. And for victims of crime, they have the right to remain a doe, because if you are a victim of a sex crime or any kind of crime, you always have the right to come forward as a doe. And that's something we should protect. For me, I was blamed for my abuse. And I was told by the powers that be, by my own parents, by my friends, that I seduced the teacher, that I caused all these problems, that I was this horrible person. And I needed to take back my story. And I realized as I have gotten older that, after so many years of being told you're a horrible person, that I have this really strong moral compass. I am very black and white about certain things, to the point where I have limited tolerance for people who make bad decisions. And so it was vitally important for me that if I'm going to make this public decision, or this kind of important decision, I had to put my name on it and be public about it, because everyone needed to know exactly where I stood on this issue. And there was no going back, and that was very important to me. And it took a long time, and I didn't even realize the public perception of me, even within the family, for the first few years. And now, even now, people are coming out and saying, oh, well, Joelle, you were a pariah. And I said, well, you know what? Maybe you're just a bad person. But it's vitally important for a lot of survivors like me to take back our stories, because I will not have my narrative defined by people who have a moral compass that is guided by fear, that is guided by a warped sense of what is important, and is guided by those who think that molesting children are people who should be in power.
So if possible, there's so many things. I wish I could talk to you for 5 hours, but so we spent a lot of times just understanding kind of the dynamics, your opinions on why these things kind of happen systemically, some of the processes that are in place, some of the motivators. I'd like to move the rest of the conversation into, so what can we do about it? So if you have an audience right now of Mormon people, who are listening to this, some are still very active in our church community, some have left, some have, a space somewhere in between. What message would you like to give to people listening as far as, okay, you are part of this community. What can you do about this? What are things you should be aware of? What are resources you should consider? What are ways you can advocate? What are ways that you can... So let's just talk to the members, not necessarily victims and survivors. I want to talk to them too in a minute, but just members listening, maybe being a little bit uncomfortable with the topic, maybe not wanting to throw their whole community under the bus, wanting to have an optimistic view of their church community. So maybe they're resistant. Maybe some people are super angry, and super willing to throw their community under the bus. So what are your thoughts in regards to just talking to a general audience?
It's okay to disagree, and it's okay to not always conform. And that does not make you unloved or unlovable. And I think that is always a good first step, because who you are as a person, God doesn't make mistakes. And who you are as a person and your opinions and your thoughts, even if they may not be in perfect conformity with your community, are your thoughts, and they're worthwhile. And if you start there, that's always a good beginning for your journey.
So you're basically validating people's concerns if they have them, or their willingness to look negatively upon some of these things, that, hey, maybe it is possible that my church could have acted in ways that are not healthy, that are not victim focused, and that I can do that without necessarily being super black and white about it.
Yeah. And I've had the opportunity since getting to know Sam and a bunch of people at the various press events, I've had the opportunity on Facebook to see discussions and to see a lot of the groupthink in various Facebook posts and stuff like that.
What do you notice?
That if you dare say anything that is negative against, and not even negative against the church, but questioning something, even minuscule, you are saying horrible things against the community and your friends. And I want to go back to the, God doesn't make mistakes. And so if the groupthink is shouting you down, that's not God shouting you down. And I just want people to internalize that and not to question their moral compass. And that if they see or think or feel something wrong, that it's okay to follow that. If the little hairs in the back of their neck stand up, don't let the group think and the community shout them down. And that it's okay to follow your conscience.
Okay, so you're noticing that as a community, as you observe us, we're not very well differentiated. Like if there's any slight, even respectful dialogue, it's immediately seen as an attack on the church as a whole. It's kind of what you're noticing.
And I'm not saying that it's unique to the LDS church. It happens in the Catholic Church, but it happens in specific communities.
Right.
Happens in the Latino community a lot. So it's the questioning of authority and faith and stuff like that. So it's I'm not saying that it's unique, but it was a little shocking to me to see.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess my next thoughts are, what would you say to actual victims and survivors of sexual assault who are, in a sense, not only having to deal with their own stories and their own experiences, but now having to deal with a pretty big community backlash, right, of all of this. And in other words, here's this movement that took in a lot of their stories. There's, of course, many, many people who never share their stories, right? So there's thousands more stories that will never probably come forward in the way that many of the stories came forward in Sam's website. And, and here's the church and how it's dealing with some of that and some of the responses. So any thoughts as to self-care, normalizing, validating, etc. to them?
Come forward and get help ASAP. I've spoken to a couple of survivors who actually have active criminal statutes. I mean, there's states like Virginia that have no criminal statute of limitation. And there are bishops who could go to jail right now. And that would send a strong message to other survivors that what happened is, this isn't a sin, this is a crime. And there is help out there. Go talk to a therapist who is someone like you, someone who understands, someone who can help, someone who will report. Because I think that if we get these survivors, especially the younger survivors with active criminal statutes of limitations, to get these sexual predators behind bars, it will send a real, real message. And if we get good victim-friendly laws in certain states, we can then peel away the layers of the onion of the cover-up. And, they can call, if they're scared to call you, they can call me, they can call anybody, but it's okay to come forward and report and talk. No one ever should sit alone and say, I'm the only one, or no one will understand.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, too, that just because you come forward, if you come forward as an adult and you're absolutely not wanting to press charges, it's not mandatory that you do so. So if that's something you really don't want to do, you can still get help for yourself personally without feeling like you have that added pressure. Now, for some people, pressing charges or filing a lawsuit, like in your case, can be very empowering, can be part of the healing journey. It can feel, just very healing in that process, but everybody is very different and unique. And I think you kind of mentioned that.
Yeah. And everyone should know what their options are. And that's something else too. Sitting alone and not knowing is very different than knowing what your options are. So, but I think that always finding a community of support is vitally important.
Let's say that you had the ear of Mormon bishops. So these are the men who are in this lay position, right? Of not the upper apostles and prophets, but your general bishop that's in a congregation. And let's assume that these bishops that we're addressing right now are not sexual predators. So they're not participating in sexual assault in kind of the typical way you think of that. What message would you want to give them about these worthiness interviews, liabilities and risks that they're facing themselves, education on what type of process they're participating in?
Well, they are the front lines of child protection, and they need to consider themselves as such. So they need to carry the banner. They need to be the ones out there saying, how do we protect our children in the best way humanly possible? And this is what I am doing personally to make sure that every kid in this ward is safer from child sexual abuse. So I am not only doing X, Y, and Z in the worthiness interviews. They are taking place in an open room with another adult with both parents present and this and that. We're renaming them, and there are no questions about sex and this and that. But we're also bringing in XYZ program to make your kid a hard target for predators. We're doing XYZ background checks. We're doing this and that. We're, so on and so forth. Because it comes from, they shouldn't be on the defensive saying, I would never do that. They should be on the offensive saying, I'm carrying the banner of child protection. Because as it is, and correct me if I'm wrong, they aren't given a whole lot of tools. to be a bishop. So they need to take it upon themselves to armor themselves with all the tools they can and become the champions for child protection within the church.
Yeah, and I think this is where it really differs from the Catholic or even other professional clergy type of relationships, because really our bishops really serve for very short times. I mean, it may not seem that way to the bishop and their families when it's like 5 years, right? But when you look, for example, I have a Catholic friend, neighbor, that was talking to me about her experience going to church in their parish right after the just recent news came out of what happened in this Pennsylvania diocese, right, for the Catholic Church. And she said that their bishop gave like a half an hour explanation of, first of all, the Catholic Church functions a little bit different. I think dioceses are more independent. So what one diocese is deciding to do is not necessarily correlated throughout the entire Catholic Church, is my understanding. And so this bishop in their church was very clear, like, this is what we've done in this parish and this diocese to make sure that these things aren't happening. We want you to know how we would deal with these types of issues if they come up. And, this man, I'm guessing, will be there for 20, 30, 40 years possibly, right? Or at least the people he's training or talking to. So whatever programs this geographical place sets up, it's kind of longer term. Whereas our bishops are in a position where they walk into kind of this correlated system without a lot of tools, don't have, I think, a lot of know-how or even say on what they can actually bring into their wards, right? Because so much of that is controlled by up high. And even if they did implement some programs, within 5 years, there's a new bishop who can completely undo that and start a whole nother way of dealing with things, in his style. So I think we do have some challenges in that regard. If it's not correlated from the top, I think it's just tougher for local bishops to have the resources in place that actually stick more than just their current stewardship time frame.
Yeah, the Catholic hierarchical structure is terminal. I mean, you're in and you're in forever. Yeah.
Right.
The training program to be a deacon alone is longer than to be a bishop in the Mormon Church. So yeah, I mean, it really is what you decide your goal is as a bishop, and it's tough, and especially with these worthiness interviews. I mean, you really have to figure out what's going to be your goal, and to be on the offensive of child protection as opposed to the defensive. You mentioned that you were surprised at the term worthiness. Can you talk a little bit about what was that about for you? How did you see that from the outside? It's very culty sounding. And I don't mean to be insulting or anything, but in the work I've done on cults, you have to be deemed worthy to enter a cult. And so that's what struck me, because I've worked, and so that's what got me, because for years, everyone said, oh, no, Mormonism isn't a cult. And I'm like, oh yeah, of course not. And then I heard these worthiness interviews and I'm like, wow, that's interesting, because after all these years of hearing, no, it's not a cult, they even called their interviews worthiness interviews. And I thought that God loved everyone the same and you wouldn't have to be deemed worthy to enter adulthood into the church. And so that's what struck me. And why is that cultish? Like, what? It's just this idea that you have to prove yourself in a certain way. Yeah, in cult behaviors, you have to deem yourself worthy to the cult leader. It's just a matter of nomenclature, a usage of words. If you're worthy as a person, so it's not who you are. It's not that you are. Who you are as a person is good enough. It's that you are deemed worthy by the group to enter. This may be outside of your scope of knowledge, but I know that, the Catholic Church has Catholic family services, right? So some type of mental health branch of some sort that's tied to the Catholic Church. I'm not sure how formally, but it definitely is tied to it. And we have something similar with LDS Family Services.
Is it in your experience that therapists or mental health professionals in Catholic Family Services are equipped or able to be part of the healing process, or are they part of the systemic kind of, kind of the systemic, not necessarily cover-ups, but definitely part of the protecting the system more so than protecting the victims?
So Catholic Family Services we have Catholic Charities, which is a kind of a separate arm, and they do the adoptions and things like that. What our problem, or the Catholic Church's problem, is with the cover-up is that victims of sexual abuse in the church usually call the church first. I did. I called the church first and said, I want to be a part of the solution. I want help, blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. And what they do is they will refer you to their list of vetted counselors. And they will say, we will pay for counseling. These are our counselors. We will pay for it. And what we have discovered through the litigation process with victims who finally come forward to sue is that the church they'll pay for counseling and then they'll stop paying before the victim is done. Or they will demand that the counselor turn over their records to the church as a third party. And so while the therapist is, usually not in cahoots per se with the church, they won't follow a specific protocol. The payments will be cut off, or they have to share their records. So anytime I talk to a survivor who says, the church is going to pay for my therapy, I always say, run away, take out a loan, talk to whatever you can do. There are other low and no cost services, but whatever you do, never accept counseling from the church, because they use it as a ploy. They want to get a hold of your records so that they can use it against you later, or they will decide when you are done with therapy and they'll yank it away from you.
Yeah, and it is very common practice for LDS Family Services to have the release for informed consent as kind of just part of their documents, so that the therapist can speak with the bishops. And there are times, obviously, being trained as a therapist myself, there are times that you may want to have a release of information with a ecclesiastical leader. If I'm working with, some troubled teen, and I know that he's in a good relationship with his minister, I might want to speak with him, just to see kind of what's going on or how that support network is helping. But it's very different, I think, when it's more systemic than that, right? So that it's kind of like it's expected, and like you're saying, payments are tied to it, and whether or not the church deems that the therapy is going the right way or is the right type of therapy, they will or will not offer the costs associated with it. And again, I speak often about how this isn't really trauma-informed care. Like, if the church was really working in a way to help victims in a trauma-informed way, they would have funds in place for victims of sexual abuse, and they would have trauma-informed organizations, not their own LDS organization, giving I think referrals, right? And here's people in your community that would be really good for you guys to reach out to, instead of kind of this insular process.
And the release isn't to a particular cleric who is very close to the survivor. The release is to the chancery office in LA, to someone that this survivor has never met. So it's going straight into his file. It's
Yeah, and the LDS Church, it's to the bishop, but what people sometimes don't understand is that the bishop then can put that information into the person's file, and then that file is church property.
Yeah.
So that then the next bishop or Salt Lake City offices or whatever, if those records are kept, which oftentimes they are, then, we're pretty good record keepers in the Mormon Church. And so then those things, you don't really know who in the church system is going to have those records of yours. Because like I said, within a short amount of time, your current bishop that you thought would be the only person who'd know this stuff about you isn't the bishop anymore.
Yeah. And we have, continually told survivors, it's like, and if you decide later on that you want to use your civil rights, you will find your medical records being used against you. And you don't want that to happen.
Can you talk about that as far as what is that? What are you referring to when you say when members want to use their civil rights?
So like in California in 2003, we had a civil window, a 1-year window where victims, no matter when they were abused, could come forward and expose their predators in the civil courts. There have been similar, there's a window in Hawaii right now, another 2-year civil window. So if someone was sexually abused in Hawaii, so if someone was sexually abused in a worthiness interview in Hawaii, they can come forward and expose the person who sexually abused them. They have 2 years to do that.
Without the statute of limitation being part of the problem is what you're saying.
Yeah. So there's no civil statute of limitations in Hawaii right now. So no matter when you were abused, if you were sexually abused in a worthiness interview in Hawaii, you can come forward and someone can contact me and I can give them more information on it. And so that's why, things like this, I forgot what the original question was. We're talking about the civil statute of limitations?
Yes. Well, yeah. You mentioned if people choose to use their civil rights.
Yeah, they choose to use their civil rights. And many states, and that's something that, people need to look into. Some states have window legislation going on, right? So Hawaii has it open right now. Other states, depending on how old you are, you might be able to come forward. You should always talk to an attorney and explore what your rights are, depending on your age and when you were abused. You might be able to come forward and expose the person who abused you to make sure they don't do it anymore. And that's what's important. The reason that I came forward, it wasn't just taking back my narrative. I wanted to make sure that he couldn't do it anymore. You want to get these guys off the streets.
Right. And then I'll just, again, mention the caveat that to not, if you're in a space where you cannot do that, please don't shame yourself in that regard. Like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. And then that means that my rapist or my predator is going to hurt other people. At the same time, if you're in a space where you can and you're resilient enough to be able and see that as part of your healing journey, then that's a wonderful way to feel like you're making a difference. Right. So I wanted to just make sure
Well, and that's the beautiful thing about how we're changing laws right now. We're working very hard to change laws so that survivors can come forward when they are ready, not when the law says they have to be. And that's a lot of the work that I'm doing right now.
Yeah. And that's such an important part. I mean, there's several women right now in our church, McKenna Denson, and there's, oh gosh, why does her name escape me right now? So bad that I can't remember her name, but there's another one they're both fairly public right now, as far as going up against these things legally. And both of them are many years later. And I think that's one of the misperceptions of the public is why now? Why didn't you do this back then? And a lot of the shaming. But if you understand trauma, and you explained that very well, is that there's a journey of figuring out. I mean, first comes self-care. First you have to look at your own wounds. And then you have a moment to look around and go, what happened to me? And then you have the moment of, oh, I understand what happened to me. And now I want to do something about it. And that can be a few weeks, that process. And that can be like decades, that process. Right. And so it's really very unique to each individual and their story.
Yeah. So that's why we're working very, very hard to change the laws, because right now the laws are set up so that this advantage predator, and we need to change that.
Yeah. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time. You're doing amazing work. You have an amazing story yourself. And I think you're a good example of how, for some people, becoming an advocate because of their own personal stories can be a really wonderful way to live life. Is there anything that you would like to say that I haven't asked you about, or that you feel maybe is missing from my questions?
No, I mean, this was a great interview. I mean, I've always enjoyed talking to you because you opened up a whole new world to me. And I have just thoroughly enjoyed getting to know you and the work that you do.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed, that's mutual. I feel like you've also opened up a lot of considerations for me to think about. And especially, I think it's always useful to step a little bit out of your own story. Like, we can get very Mormon-esque about it, right? Or very Catholic about it. And I think it's just very good to see, okay, these are some patterns, and issues that we see systemically in many organizations. And then that can be very helpful for us to also then hone in on what's unique about my particular organization, right? My particular group. And so that then it can be somewhat normalized, but then to your point, not so normalized that we don't take responsibility for what our group is, is doing in regards to these processes. So I really appreciate what you're all about, Joelle.
Oh, thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks for your time. And again, for any of you listening who enjoy these podcasts and find them valuable, I hope that you'll share them. I hope you'll comment. I hope that you'll donate. You can go to mormonmentalhealth.org to make a donation. Please, let me know what you like, what you don't like, what you'd like to hear more of. Always open to feedback. And I hope everybody has a great, healthy week ahead. Take care.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary,
ordinary.
No, it's extraordinary.